Hello, and welcome to Wrestler Spotlight. I'm the Maritime Warrior, and today we bring you the excellence of execution, Bret the Hit Man Hart. Bret, a second-generation wrestler, son of Stu Hart, got his start in pro wrestling in his father's territory, Stampede Wrestling. While in Stampede, he feuded with the likes of Leo Burke, the Dynamite Kid, and Bad News Allen. In Stampede, he would win the North American Heavyweight title 6 times, the International Tag Team titles 6 times, and the British Commonwealth Mid-Heavyweight title 3 times. In the early 80s, Bret would also have some tours with New Japan Pro Wrestling. In 1984, Bret Hart would start working for the WWF. The original character they wanted to give Bret Hart was Cowboy Bret Hart. But Bret didn't want to be a cowboy. He gave the idea, put me with Jim Neidhart, call us the Hart Foundation, have Jimmy Hart become our manager, and the rest, as they say, is history. The first few rivals of the Hart Foundations were the Killer Bees and the British Bulldogs. The Hart Foundation would even challenge the U.S. Express for the WWF World Tag Team titles, unsuccessfully. But the best matches from that era's WWF was the British Bulldogs versus the Hart Foundation. The Hart Foundation would finally win the WWF World Tag Team titles in January of 1987, defeating their rivals, the British Bulldogs. This was a very short match because the Dynamite Kid had a severe back injury. The Hart Foundation would defend their titles against tag teams like the Killer Bees, the Rougeau Brothers, the Islanders, the British Bulldogs, the Can-Am Connection, the Dream Team, and the Young Stallions, before losing the titles to Strikeforce. The Hart Foundation were the champions for 274 days. In 1988, the Hart Foundation would turn babyface, and they would feud with Jimmy Hart and his new heel tag team of the fabulous Rougeau Brothers. At SummerSlam 1988, the Hart Foundation would get another chance at the WWF World Tag Team titles versus Demolition. The problem was, not only did Demolition have Mr. Fuji in their corner, but they had Jimmy Hart, the Hart Foundation's former manager, in their corner as well. The Harts would lose that match at SummerSlam 1988, and they would continue to feud with Jimmy Hart going into 1989. At the beginning of 1989, they were still feuding with the fabulous Rougeaus, but also feuding with Greg the Hammer Valentine and the Honky Tonk Man, even defeating Greg the Hammer Valentine and the Honky Tonk Man at WrestleMania 5. Bret would also start wrestling singles matches in 1989. He would wrestle guys like Dino Bravo, Bad News Brown, and Mr. Perfect. Going into 1990, the Harts were on a quest to win back the WWF World Tag Team titles. They would have a match with the Bolsheviks at WrestleMania 6 and defeat them in 19 seconds. After WrestleMania 6, the Hart Foundation would start feuding with WWF World Tag Team Champions Demolition. It's during their feud with Demolition that Axe and Smash would bring in a third member of Demolition, Crush. This would all lead to SummerSlam 1990, where the Hart Foundation would take on Demolition in a best 2 out of 3 falls match. The Hart Foundation would finally win the tag team titles for a second time on this night. They would have a little bit of help on that night from the Legion of Doom, Animal and Hawk. The first few months, they would defend their titles versus Rhythm and Blues, Greg Valentine, and Honky Tonk Man. On October 30th, 1990, the Harts would lose the WWF World Tag Team titles to the Rockers in a best 2 out of 3 falls match. But during the match, the top rope would break, and the match would not air for many years. The belts were returned to the Hart Foundation, and the Rockers would never be WWF World Tag Team Champions. To end 1990, the Harts would defend the titles versus Rhythm and Blues, Power and Glory, and Demolition. At WrestleMania 7, the Hart Foundation would lose the WWF World Tag Team titles to the Nasty Boys, and this would be the end of the original Hart Foundation, as Bret would become a single star after this. Bret Hart would start feuding with Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental title. This would bring us to SummerSlam 1991, where Bret Hart would finally win his first singles title in the WWF, defeating Mr. Perfect, starting his first reign as WWF Intercontinental Champion. Bret would hold the title until January of 1992. He would lose the title to the Mountie on a house show right before the Royal Rumble. At the Royal Rumble 2 days later, the Mountie would lose the Intercontinental title to Rowdy Roddy Piper, and this would set up Bret Hart versus Rowdy Roddy Piper at WrestleMania 8 for the Intercontinental title. Bret Hart would win his second Intercontinental title at WrestleMania 8, defeating Rowdy Roddy Piper. Bret Hart would lose the Intercontinental title at SummerSlam 1992 at Wembley Stadium, but he would move on to bigger and better things. Around this time period, the steroid scandal was happening in the WWF, so the company was going with smaller wrestlers. Bret Hart fit their image perfectly. On October 12, 1992, Bret Hart would defeat Ric Flair in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada to become the WWF World Heavyweight Champion. Basically, Bret Hart's first world title run started at a house show. To me, the WWF never treated Bret Hart like he was their top guy, their number one priority. There was always someone better than Bret in their eyes. Even the guys they had Bret defending the world title against was not really main event quality wrestlers. Guys like the Berserker, Nails, Papa Shango, Rick Martel, Virgil, and Kamala. He would have his first world title match versus Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series 1992, beating him with his sharpshooter. He would defend his title a few more times versus former champion Ric Flair to end 1992. At the Royal Rumble in 1993, Bret would defend his title versus Razor Ramon. The Royal Rumble match that night would be won by Yokozuna, and this was the first time in WWF history where the winner of the Royal Rumble was guaranteed a shot at the WWF World Heavyweight title at WrestleMania 9. In the main event of WrestleMania 9, Bret Hart would lose the WWF World Heavyweight title to Yokozuna when Mr. Fuji would throw salt in Bret Hart's eyes. Hulk Hogan would come out to help Bret Hart and was challenged by Yokozuna and Mr. Fuji for a world title match right now. Hogan would accept, and within seconds Hogan was the new WWF World Heavyweight Champion. WWF was going backwards here. Another example of WWF not trusting Bret Hart as the number one guy. According to Bret Hart, this was all supposed to lead to a SummerSlam 1993 match between Bret and Hulk Hogan, where Hulk Hogan would put over Bret Hart and Bret Hart would be the new WWF World Heavyweight Champion. Supposedly, even pictures were taken of Bret and Hogan doing a tug-of-war with the WWF World Heavyweight title. Ultimately, the match would never happen. Hogan would lose the title to Yokozuna at King of the Ring, and Hogan would leave the WWF. Bret Hart would win the King of the Ring tournament, though, and start feuding with Jerry the King Lawler going into SummerSlam 1993. Right before their match at SummerSlam 1993, Jerry Lawler would come out with an injured leg, saying that he was in a car accident, and that he could not wrestle, but he had a replacement for Bret the Hit Man Hart. Enter Doink the Clown. Bret would defeat Doink the Clown, but then after that, Jerry Lawler would attack Bret Hart, and their scheduled match would happen as planned. At the end of the match, Bret would put on the sharpshooter on Jerry Lawler. Jerry Lawler would submit, but Bret would refuse to let go of the sharpshooter. Therefore, Jerry Lawler would win by disqualification. This would lead to the Survivor Series, where Bret Hart would team up with his brothers Owen Hart, Keith Hart, and Bruce Hart versus Shawn Michaels and his three knights. The original plan obviously was Jerry Lawler, but he could not be there, so they brought in Shawn Michaels for the match. The Harts would win this Survivor Series match. The only member eliminated was Owen Hart, and that started the brother versus brother rivalry between Bret Hart versus Owen Hart. Things seemed to smooth over with Bret and Owen. They would even challenge the Quebecers for the WWF World Tag Team titles at the Royal Rumble. But Bret had injured his knee during the match and was unable to continue, so they awarded the match to the Quebecers. At the end of the match, Bret is struggling to get to his feet while Owen is screaming at him that he cost them the match. By the time Bret got to his feet, Owen kicked Bret in his injured leg. This would lead into their legendary match at WrestleMania 10. But before we get to WrestleMania, Bret was not done with the Royal Rumble. He would be in the Royal Rumble match, and he would be a co-winner with Lex Luger. So he would also challenge for the world title at WrestleMania 10. At WrestleMania 10, Bret and Owen would be the opening match and would be the best opening match in any WrestleMania in history. And the shocker here was Owen won the match. He rolled up Bret and got the 1-2-3. Don't feel too bad for Bret though, because at the end of the night he would challenge Yokozuna, the same man that beat him for the world title 1 year ago, and he would defeat him to win the WWF World Heavyweight title for a second time. All the babyface wrestlers would come out to celebrate with Bret, even putting Bret on their shoulders. But at the entrance ramp, there's Owen Hart going, "What about me?" This would plant the seeds for SummerSlam. Before SummerSlam, though, Bret would have his first pay-per-view title defense at King of the Ring versus Diesel. Bret would lose by disqualification thanks to Jim the Anvil Neidhart. Later that night, Owen Hart would win the King of the Ring. So now the stage is set. Bret Hart versus Owen Hart at SummerSlam for the WWF World Heavyweight title in a steel cage. The steel cage match at SummerSlam, not my favorite Bret and Owen match. I find the match extremely boring, my personal opinion. But another thing that annoyed me is they didn't give them the main event spot. The main event was Undertaker versus Undertaker. Bret would successfully defend the WWF title versus Owen, and it put a pause on their feud. Bret's next big challenger would be Bob Backlund, who would turn heel and become this psychopath. Bret would successfully defend his title against Bob Backlund on an episode of Superstars, and that's when Bob Backlund would snap. Putting the chicken wing on Bret Hart and refusing to let go, this would lead to a match at Survivor Series. Their match at Survivor Series could only be won when your cornerman would throw in the towel. Bret's cornerman was Davey Boy Smith, and Owen Hart was Bob Backlund's cornerman. During the match, Davey Boy got knocked out, so Owen Hart convinced Helen Hart to throw in the towel while Bret Hart was in the chicken wing. Bob Backlund was the brand new WWF World Heavyweight Champion. Bret's second reign ends at 248 days. It's my favorite Bret Hart world title reign because it's his year as champion, 94. While he defended the title a lot in the mid-card and never really main evented any pay-per-views outside of WrestleMania, it's still my favorite. Bret would continue to feud with Bob Backlund until WrestleMania 11 when he would defeat Bob Backlund in a submission match, ending their feud. Bret would win his third WWF World Heavyweight title at Survivor Series 1995 when he would defeat Diesel. During this title reign, Bret would defend the title against Davey Boy Smith, Diesel, and The Undertaker. From the moment he defeated Diesel to win his third WWF title, the plan was already set for him to drop the title to Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 12. Bret and Shawn would main event WrestleMania 12 in a 60-minute Iron Man match, and Shawn Michaels would start his first reign as WWF World Heavyweight Champion. Once again, not my favorite match. I hate this match. This Iron Man match, long, boring, not my cup of tea. After WrestleMania, Bret would take some time off. During his time off, he kept getting challenged by a newcomer, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Bret would make his return at Survivor Series 1996, and he would accept Stone Cold Steve Austin's challenge, and he would defeat Stone Cold Steve Austin. Bret would enter the 1997 Royal Rumble looking to win it, and it seemed like he did. Bret had eliminated Stone Cold Steve Austin, but the referees never saw it, so Stone Cold got back into the ring, eliminated Bret Hart, and was awarded the match. This would start planting the seeds for a Bret Hart heel turn, where everybody is screwing Bret Hart. At the next pay-per-view called In Your House Final Four, the Final Four of the Royal Rumble, Bret Hart, Stone Cold Steve Austin, Vader, and The Undertaker would fight for the vacant WWF World Heavyweight title. Bret would win this match, winning his fourth WWF World Heavyweight title, but it would only last 24 hours. The very next night on Raw, Psycho Sid would win his second WWF World Heavyweight title. Bret would rematch Sid a few weeks later in a steel cage, but would lose again, and at this point, this is where he knocked Vince McMahon down on his backside and say that everybody is screwing him. We're getting closer and closer to heel Bret Hart. At WrestleMania 13, with Ken Shamrock as the special guest referee, Bret Hart and Stone Cold Steve Austin would meet in a submission match. Bret would win that match when a bloody Stone Cold Steve Austin would pass out from the pain while in the sharpshooter. After he was declared the winner, Bret would continue to kick Austin's legs, turning heel in the process. During this heel run, Bret would reform the Hart Foundation, but not as a tag team, as a stable, with Owen Hart, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith, and Brian Pillman. At SummerSlam 1997, Bret would get a shot at The Undertaker for the WWF World Heavyweight title, with Shawn Michaels as the special guest referee. During the match, Bret would try to use a chair on The Undertaker. Shawn Michaels would stop him and take the chair. Bret would then spit at Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels would swing the chair, miss Bret, hit The Undertaker, and then would have to make the 1-2-3 to crown Bret Hart the new WWF World Heavyweight Champion. This would start Bret Hart's fifth and final reign as WWF World Heavyweight Champion. He would feud with the likes of The Patriot, The Undertaker, and D-Generation X. Bret and Shawn would meet one final time at the Survivor Series in 1997. This is the Montreal Screwjob match. We all know this story. Bret is put in his own sharpshooter by Shawn Michaels, and Vince McMahon calls for them to ring the bell. The story here is Bret had signed a 20-year contract with the WWF that Vince could not honor. So he told Bret, go to WCW, get as much money as you can. Bret had creative control in his contract for his last 30 days, I believe it was. So if he didn't want to do something, he wasn't going to do it. And losing the title to Shawn Michaels, who had been very disrespectful to him, was not a thing he wanted to do. According to Vince McMahon now, he couldn't have Bret Hart showing up on WCW with his belt. So the screw job happened and Bret Hart was on his way to WCW, where he would be basically wasted. The first thing WCW had Bret Hart doing after the Montreal screw job is have him be the special guest referee for Starrcade 97 Hollywood Hogan vs. Sting for the WCW title. In 1998, they had Bret Hart turn heel and join the NWO and feud with Sting and Diamond Dallas Page. Bret Hart would win the United States Heavyweight title 4 times while in WCW and the tag team titles once. Between 1999 and the year 2000, Bret Hart would win the WCW World Heavyweight title twice, and he would feud with Goldberg. During a match with Goldberg, Bret would be kicked in the head and would have post-concussion syndrome. This would basically be the move that ended Bret the Hitman Hart's career in wrestling. In 2002, Bret Hart would have a stroke and would be hospitalized for a while. In 2006, Bret Hart would be the headliner for the WWE Hall of Fame. Bret Hart would return to WWE TV for the first time since 1997, not counting the Hall of Fame. He would have a match with Vince McMahon at WrestleMania 26, beating him with the sharpshooter. He would even defeat The Miz to win the WWE United States Championship. He would be part of Team WWE versus Team Nexus in the main event of SummerSlam 2010. And finally, in 2019, the Hart Foundation, Bret Hart and Jim the Anvil Neidhart, would be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. My final thoughts on Bret Hart is, he was never the draw that Hulk Hogan or The Ultimate Warrior or Stone Cold Steve Austin or The Rock was, but the new generation would have suffered a lot more without Bret Hart. Even during the dark times of the new generation, Bret was your number one guy, but they're always looking to replace him with Lex Luger or with Diesel, but Bret was your best choice there as your ace. There was no one other than him that could have carried that company at that point in time. Now, that still doesn't mean that I think he's a huge draw, because he's clearly not. The numbers during the new generation era are abysmal, and they would only get better with the Attitude Era, something that Bret Hart helped create, though. Bret Hart reminds me of the best player on a rebuilding hockey team. He's there to hold the fort until the team is ready to go, but by the time the team is ready to go, he's out the door. And with that, that's going to be the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I'm going to probably piss off some people with my comments, but it is what it is. Bret's one of the all-time greats. I'm not denying that at all. So thank you for listening, and have a great day.